Power in England was never held by kings alone. For over 3 centuries, much of it belonged to the Stanleys. Some families fight their way to greatness. Some inherit it. The Stanleys did neither. They waited for it. They rose out of the damp fields of Lancashire and the forests of Cheshire, not through great battles won or bold declarations of loyalty, but through something far more dangerous. Patience. They married well. They served whichever king was standing. And when the moment came to choose, they chose last, and they chose right. They placed a crown upon a man's head and changed the course of English history. They ruled an island kingdom. They stood beside Shakespeare. They defended their castle when all seemed lost. And centuries later, a Stanley would give the world its most famous sporting trophy. Tonight, we tell the whole story of their long and cunning rise, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Stanley and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history, unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Stanley surprised you the most, help these stories find others who need them. There is a place in the moorlands of Staffordshire called Stanley. It is a quiet, unassuming place today, and it was a quiet, unassuming place 800 years ago. But it gave its name to a family, and that family, generation by patient generation, would grow into one of the most powerful and enduring dynasties in English history. The name itself is thoroughly English. It comes from the Old English words stan and lea, meaning stone clearing or stony meadow, a description of the rough, thin-soiled landscape of the Staffordshire moorlands where the family first held land. It was not a name that announced greatness. It was a name that spoke of modest beginnings, of a family rooted in the hard, unglamorous work of farming and forest management. And yet, it was this family, not the mighty Plantagenets, not the gilded Beauforts, not the warlike Percys, that would one day decide who sat on the throne of England. The earliest known ancestor of the Stanleys was a man called Adam de Stanley, who lived during the troubled reign of King Stephen in the 12th century. Very little is remembered about Adam, save that he had a brother named Leulf de Audley, from whom the noble Audley family would descend. In those days, the Stanleys were not lords or earls. They held no great castles. They were minor landholders in the Midlands, part of the broad class of English gentry who lived close to the soil and owed service to greater men above them. For a long time, the Stanleys remained in that middling position. They had enough to live comfortably, but not enough to stand out. They passed their modest lands from father to son, married local women of similar station, and served in the offices that men of their rank were expected to fill. It was steady, unremarkable work. The kind of life that fills the records of medieval England by the thousands and leaves no particular impression on the wider story of the realm. But around the year 1284, something changed. A Stanley named William married an heiress. We do not know her name for certain. And through that marriage, he acquired the forestership of the Wirral, a long finger of land in Cheshire that juts out between the River Dee and the River Mersey. The Wirral was a wild, wooded place in those days, home to outlaws and poachers, and the forestership meant authority over it. It was not a grand title, but it was a foothold. It gave the Stanleys a presence in Cheshire, a county that would become central to their story, and it gave them something even more valuable than land. It gave them the habit of service. The Stanleys now had a role. They were the crown's men in the Wirral, and they carried out that role with a certain rough vigour. William de Stanley had at least 2 sons who survived to manhood. The elder, also called William, inherited the forestership and continued the family's work in the Wirral. He was, by the accounts that survive, a hard man. The foresters of the Wirral had a reputation for heavy-handed enforcement, and the elder William did nothing to soften it. The family lived at Staunton, and they were known in the locality as men you did not cross lightly. The younger son was named John, and it was John who would change everything. Sir John Stanley, later known to history as Sir John Stanley I, to distinguish him from his son and grandson of the same name, was born around the year 1350. He was a second son, which in medieval England meant that he had all the breeding and upbringing of a gentleman, but very little of the inheritance. The lands, the title of forester, the seat at Staunton, all of that would pass to his elder brother. John would have to make his own way, and make his own way he did. The young John Stanley entered the service of the crown, and he proved himself capable, ambitious, and remarkably adaptable. He served under Richard II, a king whose reign was troubled from its earliest days, and he held a string of offices in Cheshire and the Welsh Marches, deputy positions, administrative roles, the kind of work that brought a man to the attention of powerful people without exposing him to dangerous enemies. But John Stanley's greatest stroke of fortune was not a battle or a commission, it was a marriage. Around 1385, John married a woman named Isabel Lathom, the daughter and eventual heiress of Sir Thomas Lathom of Lathom and Knowsley in Lancashire. It was a match that looked, on paper, like a respectable but unremarkable alliance. A second son marrying the daughter of a Lancashire knight. But a series of unexpected deaths in the Lathom family meant that Isabel would inherit everything. Lathom House, the family's ancient seat near Ormskirk, came to John through his wife. Knowsley, a hunting lodge to the south surrounded by a great park, came with it. And with those estates came tenants, rents, influence, and a permanent base in Lancashire. It is difficult to overstate how much this marriage mattered. Before Isabel, the Stanleys were Cheshire foresters, respectable, useful, but minor. After Isabel, they were Lancashire magnates with one of the finest houses in the county and a web of local connections stretching across the northwest of England. The marriage to Isabel Lathom was the foundation stone of everything the Stanleys would become, and it was accomplished not through war or treachery, but through the quiet, patient mechanism of a well-judged marriage. John settled into his new estates and continued to serve the crown. He rose steadily through the ranks of royal administration. He was made controller of the royal household under Henry IV, the Lancastrian king who had overthrown Richard II in 1399. John had served Richard faithfully, but he transferred his loyalty to Henry without difficulty. An early example of the Stanley talent for smooth transitions between regimes. In 1403, John proved his worth on the battlefield as well. At the Battle of Shrewsbury, where Henry IV faced a rebellion led by the powerful Percy family, John fought on the king's side and was wounded in the throat. He survived, and Henry did not forget the loyalty. 2 years later, in 1405, the king granted John Stanley a prize that would define his family for 300 years. The Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is a small island set in the middle of the Irish Sea, roughly equidistant from England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. It had its own laws, its own traditions, and its own ancient system of government. The Tynwald, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, which met in the open air on a tiered hill at the centre of the island, as it had since the time of the Vikings. The island had its own bishop, its own courts, and its own distinctive character, shaped by centuries of Norse settlement and by the peculiarities of its geography. a windswept, rain-lashed place surrounded by some of the most treacherous waters in the British Isles. For centuries, the island had been ruled by Scandinavian sea kings, then by the kings of Scotland, and finally by a succession of English lords who held it as a fief of the English crown. The most recent of these lords had been the Percy family, the same powerful, ambitious Percys who had just rebelled against Henry IV at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Their lands and titles were forfeit, and Henry needed a reliable man to take charge of the island. A man who had proven his loyalty on the battlefield and who could be trusted to hold this strategically important piece of territory against any future threat from Scotland or Ireland. He chose John Stanley. The initial grant in 1405 gave John the Isle of Man for his lifetime only. It was a generous reward, but it was also a practical one. Henry needed someone to govern the island immediately, and John was available, capable, and recently proven in battle. But the following year, in 1406, a new grant was issued, and this one was different. This time, the lordship of the island was made inheritable. John Stanley and his heirs forever would rule the Isle of Man. The only condition was a feudal tribute. At every English coronation, the Stanleys were to present the new king or queen with 2 falcons. It was a remarkable grant. The Stanleys were now, in effect, kings of their own small island. And they used that title openly. For 4 generations, they styled themselves King of Man, a title that sat alongside their English offices and estates and gave them a grandeur that few other noble families could match. John Stanley spent the remaining years of his life in service to the crown. He was elected a Knight of the Garter around 1405, the highest honour of English chivalry, and he served a second term as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. It was during this second Irish appointment that John Stanley died, at the town of Ardee in County Louth, in the year 1414. His body was brought back to Lancashire and buried at Burscough Priory, near Ormskirk, close to the Lathom estates that his marriage had won for the family. He had entered the world as a second son with no inheritance. He left it as a Knight of the Garter, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and King of Man, with estates stretching across Lancashire, Cheshire, and an island kingdom in the Irish Sea. He had done it through service, through marriage, and through an uncanny ability to be useful to whichever king happened to be wearing the crown. It is worth pausing here to consider what the Isle of Man meant to the Stanleys. This was not merely a piece of property or an additional source of revenue, though it was both of those things. The Isle of Man was a kingdom, small, windswept and remote, but a kingdom nonetheless. It had its own parliament, the Trémoille, which is one of the oldest continuously sitting legislatures in the world. It had its own laws, its own church, the dioceses of Sodor and Man, and its own traditions stretching back to the age of the Norse sea kings. To rule the Isle of Man was to exercise a sovereignty that went beyond anything an English baron or even an earl could normally claim. The Stanleys were not merely landlords on the island, they were its kings. The tribute that sealed the arrangement was wonderfully medieval in its symbolism. At every English coronation, the Stanleys were to present the new monarch with 2 falcons, living birds, symbols of wildness and beauty, offered in acknowledgement of the English crown's ultimate authority over the island. It was a gesture that balanced deference with dignity, and it would continue for generations, binding the Stanleys to the rhythms of English kingship in a way that was both ceremonial and deeply practical. Sir John Stanley had risen from nothing to everything, and he had done it without dramatic reversals or great betrayals. His career was a masterclass in quiet competence, in being the man who was always ready, always reliable, and always in the right place at the right time. He served under Richard II without becoming entangled in Richard's disastrous quarrels with his nobles. He transferred to Henry IV without apparent difficulty and proved himself at Shrewsbury and in the governance of Ireland. He gathered offices and honours as others might gather stones for a wall, one by one, steadily, until the structure was complete. When his body was laid to rest in Burscough Priory, surrounded by the cold Lancashire earth, Sir John Stanley left behind a family that was unrecognisably different from the one into which he had been born. The Stanleys of Sturton, obscure, rough-handed foresters of the Wirral, were gone. In their place stood the Stanleys of Lathom, Knowsley, and the Isle of Man, a family of wealth, of influence, and of ambition, poised on the threshold of the most dangerous century in English history. His descendants would perfect the art he had begun. Sir John Stanley II, the son of the great Sir John, inherited his father's titles and estates in 1414. He was around 28 years old, and he stepped into a position of considerable power and responsibility. He was now King of Man, Lord of Lathom and Knowsley, and one of the leading men of Lancashire. He held offices in Cheshire and North Wales, and he was expected to maintain the family's standing at court and in the northwest. John II was, by all accounts, a capable administrator. He held the Island of Man in order, maintained the family's influence in Lancashire, and served the crown in various capacities. He was Sheriff of Anglesey, Constable of Caernarfon, Justice of Chester, and Steward of Macclesfield, a list of offices that speaks to the family's deep roots in the governance of the Northwest. He was not a man of dramatic deeds or great battles, but he was steady and reliable. And in an age when families could lose everything in a single disastrous decision, steadiness had its own kind of value. The family's landholdings continued to grow during John II's tenure. The Stanleys now controlled a network of manors and estates stretching from the Wirral in Cheshire to the heart of Lancashire, with outposts in North Wales and a kingdom in the Irish Sea. Their income was enormous by the standards of the English gentry, and their household was one of the largest in the northwest. They maintained a private army of retainers, men who wore the Stanley livery, answered the Stanley call to arms, and looked to the Stanleys, rather than the king, as the true source of authority in the region. This was not unusual in 15th century England. The great magnates of the realm all maintained private armies and exercised a quasi-royal authority within their own territories. But the Stanleys were exceptional in the sheer breadth and depth of their regional control. In Lancashire and Cheshire, the word of a Stanley carried more weight than the word of the king, and everyone, from the humblest tenant farmer to the most ambitious local knight, understood it. The family's power was not just political, it was social, economic, and cultural. The Stanleys were the patrons of churches, the builders of bridges, the dispensers of justice, and the guarantors of order. To live in the northwest of England was, in many practical respects, to live under Stanley rule. John II died in 1437, and his son Thomas succeeded him. This Thomas Stanley, who would become the first Baron Stanley, was the man who would take the family from regional power to national significance. Thomas was born around the year 1405. He married Joan Gushill, a woman of excellent connections. Her mother was Elizabeth Fitzalan, a daughter of the Earl of Arundel, which linked the Stanleys to one of the oldest and grandest families in England. Through Joan, the Stanleys gained not only prestige but also a network of relationships that extended well beyond Lancashire. Thomas served as King of Man from 1437, and he represented Lancashire in the House of Commons on multiple occasions. In 1427, 1433, 1439, 1442, 1447, 1449, 1450, 1453 and 1455, a record of service that demonstrates both his political stamina and his family's firm grip on the representation of the county. He was made a Privy Councillor, Comptroller of the Royal Household, and Chief Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, offices that put him at the very centre of royal government. And in 1456, he was summoned to Parliament as Lord Stanley, the first member of his family to sit in the House of Lords. The years of Thomas's rise were also years of mounting crisis for the English crown. King Henry VI, who had inherited the throne as a baby in 1422, was proving to be one of the weakest and most unfortunate kings in English history. He was pious, gentle, and wholly unsuited to the brutal business of medieval governance. His mental health was fragile. In 1453, he suffered a complete mental collapse that left him unable to recognize his own wife and son for more than a year. During his incapacity, the government fell into the hands of competing factions, and the great nobles of England, men like the Duke of York, the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Warwick, and the Earl of Salisbury, began to circle each other like wolves around a weakened deer. Thomas Stanley, 1st Baron Stanley, watched these developments with the careful, calculating eye that would become the hallmark of his family. He had connections to both sides. He was a servant of the Lancastrian king, but his networks extended across the political spectrum. He was, in the language of the time, a man who kept his own counsel, a phrase that in practice meant a man who refused to be pinned down. The creation of the Stanley barony was a milestone. The family had moved in just 3 generations from the forestership of the Wirral to the peerage of England. They were no longer merely wealthy landowners or useful administrators. They were lords of the realm, with a voice in Parliament and a seat among the great men of the kingdom. But Thomas, 1st Baron Stanley, died in February 1459, at a moment when England was sliding toward the greatest crisis of the 15th century. The long, quiet struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, a conflict born of weak kingship, overreaching nobles, and disputed claims to the throne, was about to explode into open war. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and the Stanleys were about to demonstrate the quality that would make them famous, infamous, and immortal, the quality that earned them the title of kingmakers and the reputation of traitors. They were about to show the world the art of not choosing. The northwest of England in the middle of the 15th century was a land of great distances, poor roads, and fierce local loyalties. It was far from London, far from the centres of royal power, and it was governed less by the king's law than by the authority of the great magnates who held land there. The Stanleys were the greatest of these magnates, but they were not alone. The Percys, the Nevilles, the Harringtons, and a host of lesser families all competed for influence in the vast, rain-soaked counties of Lancashire, Cheshire, and Cumberland. Feuds between these families could simmer for decades, occasionally erupting into armed clashes that the crown was too far away, and often too weak, to prevent. It was in this world that the Stanleys had built their power, and it was this world that gave Thomas Stanley, the future 1st Earl of Derby, his education in survival. He learned from his father and his grandfather before him that a wise man in Lancashire did not make enemies unnecessarily. He learned that a well-placed marriage was worth more than a well-fought battle. And he learned above all that the surest path to power was not to seize it, but to be the man without whom no one else could hold it. These lessons would serve him well in the years ahead, for the quiet of the English countryside was about to be shattered by a conflict that would consume the lives of kings and commoners alike. A conflict that would last, in one form or another, for 30 years, and that would earn a name that has echoed through the centuries ever since. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and the Stanleys were about to demonstrate the quality that would make them famous, infamous, and immortal. The man who inherited the Stanley lordship in February 1459 was named Thomas, like his father before him. This second Thomas, Thomas Stanley, the future 1st Earl of Derby, would become one of the most controversial figures of the 15th century. He was brilliant, calculating, endlessly patient and possessed of a political instinct so finely tuned that it has been debated by historians for 500 years. Was he a traitor or a pragmatist, a coward or a genius? The answer, as with so many things about the Stanleys, depends entirely on where you stand. Thomas was born around 1435, the eldest son of the first Baron Stanley and Joan Gouchel. He had grown up in one of the wealthiest and most powerful households in the northwest of England, surrounded by the apparatus of Stanley power. The great house at Lathom, the hunting lodge at Knowsley, the rents and tenants of dozens of manors across Lancashire and Cheshire, and the ancient title of King of Man, which set the Stanleys apart from every other English noble family. Thomas entered royal service early. In 1454, when he was about 19 years old, he was appointed a squire to King Henry VI. It was a position of honour and proximity. The squires of the body attended the king in his private chambers, dressed him, served him at table, and witnessed the intimate workings of royal government at first hand. Henry was a gentle, pious man who had inherited the throne as a baby and had struggled to hold it ever since. He suffered from bouts of mental illness, periods when he withdrew entirely from the world and could not recognize even his own wife and son. During these episodes, the kingdom was governed by a council of nobles, and it was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and factional rivalry that the young Thomas Stanley learned his trade. He learned it well. He watched the great lords of England maneuver for advantage, and he saw what happened to those who committed too soon or backed the wrong side. He saw men lose their lands, their titles, and their heads because they had chosen a faction and stuck with it. And he resolved very early on that he would never make the same mistake. The first test came in 1459, just months after Thomas inherited the barony. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the fierce and determined wife of the mentally fragile Henry VI, was gathering forces to destroy the Yorkist lords who were challenging her husband's rule. She ordered Thomas Stanley to raise an army and intercept Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, a Yorkist lord who was marching south with his forces to join the Duke of York. Now, here was the difficulty. Thomas was a servant of the Lancastrian king, and the Queen's command was lawful. But Thomas had recently married Eleanor Neville, the daughter of the very Earl of Salisbury he was being ordered to fight. Eleanor was also the sister of Richard Neville, the young Earl of Warwick, the man who would soon earn the title the Kingmaker. Thomas Stanley was, in other words, being asked to destroy his own father-in-law and brother-in-law. He did what only a Stanley could do. He raised his army, 2,000 men as the Queen had commanded, and he marched them to within a few miles of the battlefield. And then he stopped. He positioned his forces close enough to be seen, close enough to matter, and close enough to intervene. But he did not fight. The Battle of Blore Heath, fought on the 23rd of September 1459, was a Yorkist victory. The Lancastrian forces were defeated, and Thomas Stanley's father-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury, escaped to fight another day. Thomas had not lifted a finger to help either side. But here was the masterpiece. After the battle, Thomas wrote letters. He wrote to Queen Margaret, assuring her of his loyalty and expressing his regret that circumstances had prevented him from engaging the enemy. And he wrote to the Earl of Salisbury, congratulating him on his victory. He kept both sides happy. He kept both sides guessing. And he kept himself alive. His brother William played a different game entirely. Sir William Stanley, the younger of the two brothers, had fought openly on the Yorkist side at Blore Heath, leading troops against the Lancastrian forces. For this, William was attainted, formally declared a traitor by the Lancastrian Parliament. His lands were forfeit, and he was an outlaw. Thomas, meanwhile, was impeached by the Commons, who suspected, rightly, that he had given Salisbury a conditional promise of support. But Thomas survived. He took the oath of allegiance, protested his innocence, and weathered the storm. The impeachment went nowhere. Thomas Stanley was still standing. This pattern, Thomas standing back while William fought openly, would repeat itself again and again over the next 25 years. It was as though the two brothers had reached an unspoken agreement. William would commit, and Thomas would hedge. Between them, the Stanley family would always have a foot on the winning side, no matter which side won. It was a strategy born not of cowardice, but of cold, careful calculation. A recognition that in a war where the fortunes of the great families could be destroyed in a single afternoon, the safest course was to be the man everyone needed, and no one could afford to punish. The months after Blore Heath saw the conflict escalate rapidly. The Yorkist lords gathered at Ludlow in an attempt to unite their forces, but they were confronted by a royal army and scattered. The Duke of York fled to Ireland. The Earls of Warwick, Salisbury, and March, the leading Yorkist commanders, fled to Calais. Thomas Stanley's retainers are recorded as having taken actions on behalf of the Yorkists during this chaotic period, though Thomas himself maintained his careful distance from any direct involvement. He was, as always, somewhere nearby, visible, available, but never quite committed. In 1460, the Yorkists returned from Calais in force. They defeated the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Northampton and captured King Henry VI himself. The Duke of York marched into Parliament and claimed the throne, only to be defeated and killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December of that year, his head placed on the gates of the city of York wearing a paper crown. But his son Edward, the young Earl of March, proved to be a far more formidable warrior than his father. In March of 1461, Edward won the most devastating battle of the entire Wars of the Roses. At Towton, in Yorkshire, fought in a blinding snowstorm on Palm Sunday, the Yorkist and Lancastrian armies clashed in what is generally considered the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Perhaps 28,000 men died in a single day. The Lancastrian army was annihilated. King Henry and Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and Edward was crowned King Edward IV. Thomas Stanley had managed, once again, to avoid committing to either side during the Towton campaign. His brother William, by contrast, had fought for the Yorkists, at Towton itself, according to some accounts, adding to his growing reputation as a reliable and courageous soldier. When the dust settled and Edward was crowned, the new king looked upon the Stanleys with the mixture of wariness and pragmatism that was becoming familiar. Thomas was made Chief Justice of Cheshire, not because Edward trusted him, but because Edward needed him. No king could govern the Northwest without the Stanleys, and every king understood it. For the next decade, Thomas served Edward IV with quiet diligence. He attended court. He sat on the royal council. He managed the Northwest. He was, by all appearances, a loyal and efficient servant of the Yorkist crown. But he never entirely burned his bridges with the Lancastrian side, and when the opportunity arose to demonstrate that ambiguity, he took it. In 1470, Thomas's brother-in-law, the Earl of Warwick, the great kingmaker, quarrelled with Edward IV over foreign policy and the influence of the Woodville family at court. Warwick made the extraordinary decision to switch sides entirely, allying himself with his former enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou, and staging an invasion of England to restore Henry VI to the throne. For a few brief months the scheme succeeded. Edward fled to Burgundy, and the feeble Henry was brought out of the Tower of London and placed back on the throne in what is known as the Readeption. Thomas Stanley, sensing the way the wind was blowing, sided with Warwick and the restored Lancastrian government. It was not a dramatic declaration. Thomas was not a man for dramatic declarations, but it was a clear alignment with the new regime. His brother William, meanwhile, does not appear to have joined this particular adventure, perhaps because William's Yorkist loyalties ran deeper, or perhaps because the two brothers had once again arranged themselves on opposite sides to hedge the family's bets. The readeption lasted less than 6 months. Edward IV returned from exile in the spring of 1471, landed in Yorkshire, and marched south, gathering supporters as he went. He met Warwick's forces at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471 and defeated them in a confused, fog-shrouded engagement. Warwick himself was killed, cut down as he tried to flee the field. His body was stripped and displayed in London as a warning to other would-be kingmakers. A few weeks later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward destroyed the last Lancastrian army. Henry VI's son, Prince Edward, was killed, either in battle or in the aftermath, depending on which account you believe, and the Lancastrian cause was effectively finished. Henry VI himself was quietly murdered in the Tower of London shortly afterwards, almost certainly on Edward's orders. It was after Tewkesbury that William Stanley performed one of the more notable feats of his military career. He captured Queen Margaret of Anjou herself, the fierce and indomitable woman who had driven the Lancastrian war effort for more than a decade. Margaret was eventually ransomed back to France, where she lived out the remainder of her life in obscurity. Thomas Stanley, meanwhile, had a problem. He had sided with the losing faction. He had supported the readeption. He had aligned himself, however cautiously, with the restored Lancastrian government. Any other man who had done these things might have expected punishment. Loss of offices, forfeiture of lands, perhaps worse. Others who had done far less were executed or driven into exile in the aftermath of Barnet and Tewkesbury. But Thomas Stanley was not any other man. He made his peace with Edward IV, and the king not only forgave him, but appointed him steward of the royal household, one of the most powerful positions in the government. It was an astonishing act of political survival. Thomas had backed the wrong side, and he had emerged from it with a promotion. How did he do it? Partly through the sheer weight of his power. Thomas controlled Lancashire. He had thousands of retainers who could be summoned at short notice. He held the Isle of Man. He was, in practical terms, irreplaceable. No king could govern the northwest without the Stanleys, and every king knew it. But there was something else too, something harder to define. Thomas Stanley had a quality that his contemporaries recognized even if they could not always name it. He was, in a word, useful. He ran things smoothly. He kept the peace. He attended councils, carried out commissions, and maintained the machinery of local government with quiet efficiency. Kings might not trust him, and there is little evidence that any of them did. But they needed him, and Thomas understood that being needed was more valuable than being loved. The death of Eleanor Neville, Thomas's first wife, around 1472, brought the first chapter of his married life to a close. Eleanor had given him several children, including his eldest son and heir, George, who was styled Lord Strange. But her death also opened a door that would lead Thomas Stanley into the most extraordinary gamble of his career, and into the very heart of the struggle for the English crown. For Thomas's second wife would be a woman whose ambition burned brighter than any king's. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was one of the most remarkable women of the 15th century. She was born on the 31st of May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, the only surviving child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Through her father, Margaret was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the son of King Edward III, a bloodline that gave her a distant but real claim to the English throne. Margaret's life had been shaped by loss and by strategy from its earliest days. Her father died when she was barely a year old, and she was married for the first time at the age of 12 to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI. Edmund was 12 years older than his child bride, and he died of plague in captivity before their son was born. Margaret, barely 13 years old, gave birth to a boy she named Henry at Pembroke Castle in Wales. The birth was so difficult that Margaret would never have another child. That boy, Henry Tudor, was destined to become the most important person in Margaret's life, and eventually in the life of every person in England. Margaret married twice more after Edmund's death. Her second husband, Sir Henry Stafford, died of wounds sustained at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, fighting for the Yorkist side. Margaret was left a widow again, and she understood, with the sharp political instinct that defined her character, that she needed a new husband immediately. Not for love or companionship, but for protection. The man she chose, or more precisely, the alliance she engineered, was Thomas Stanley. The marriage took place around June of 1472. It was, by every account, a match of pure political calculation. Margaret brought to the marriage her Beaufort connections, her proximity to the royal court, and, most crucially, her son. Henry Tudor, the last credible Lancastrian claimant to the throne, who was living in exile in Brittany under the protection of the Duke. Thomas brought his vast estates, his thousands of retainers, and his position as one of the most powerful men in England. Together, they were formidable. Margaret used her new position as Lady Stanley to cultivate relationships at the Yorkist court. She became a favourite of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV, and was even chosen as godmother to one of the royal princesses. All the while she kept her lines of communication open with her exiled son. She never stopped believing that Henry Tudor would one day return to England and claim the crown. She never stopped working toward that goal. Thomas, for his part, seems to have understood what he was getting. Margaret was not a woman who would sit quietly at Lathom and manage the household. She was a political operative of the First Order, and her ambitions for her son were limitless. Thomas may not have shared those ambitions, at least not openly, but he provided Margaret with the one thing she needed above all else, a position of strength from which to operate. The marriage also gave Thomas something he had not had before. Through Margaret, he was now connected to the Lancastrian cause, not in the obvious, dangerous way that would attract attention, but in the quiet, deniable way that suited his temperament perfectly. If the Lancastrians ever came back to power, Thomas Stanley would be the stepfather of the king. If the Yorkists stayed in power, Thomas Stanley was still the loyal steward of the household, the dependable magnate of the Northwest, the man who kept his head down and got things done. It was the most perfectly hedged position in English politics. For the next decade, Thomas and Margaret lived in this delicate balance. Thomas continued to serve Edward IV faithfully, or at least appeared to. He attended court, sat on the King's Council, and fulfilled his duties as steward of the household. Margaret moved through the court with grace and discretion, attending to her charities and her prayers, and quietly building the network of supporters that would one day bring her son home. Then, in April of 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 40. He had been a vigorous, imposing man, tall, handsome, and physically powerful. But years of rich living, heavy drinking, and political stress had taken their toll. He left behind two young sons, the 12-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, who was now King Edward V, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. He also left behind a kingdom that was immediately plunged into crisis. The dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved with a swiftness and ruthlessness that caught nearly everyone off guard. He intercepted the young king on his way to London from Ludlow, arrested members of the boy's maternal family, the Woodvilles, who had been the dominant faction at Edward IV's court, and established himself as Lord Protector of the realm. The young king was lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for his own protection. His brother Richard was sent to join him there a few weeks later. Within 2 months, Richard of Gloucester had transformed himself from protector to king. He produced a clergyman, one Dr. Ralph Shah, who preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, and that therefore their children were illegitimate and had no claim to the throne. An assembly of lords and commons, hastily convened, endorsed this view and offered the crown to Richard. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III. The 2 young princes remained in the Tower. They were seen playing in the gardens during the summer of 1483, and then they were never seen again. What happened to them, whether they were murdered, and if so, by whom, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of English history. But the widespread belief, both at the time and ever since, was that Richard had ordered their deaths. It was a belief that would haunt his reign and ultimately contribute to his downfall. Thomas Stanley found himself in an extraordinarily difficult position. He had been loyal to Edward IV, and he was now expected to transfer that loyalty to Richard III, a man who had seized the throne from a child and whose relationship with the Stanleys had been fraught for years. The roots of the tension went back to the early 1470s, when Richard, as the young Duke of Gloucester, had been sent by Edward IV to curb the expanding power of the Stanley family in Lancashire. Richard had been granted lands and offices in the Duchy of Lancaster, the traditional power base of the Stanleys, and the resulting friction had never fully healed. Thomas Stanley and Richard of Gloucester were men who had been competing for influence in the same territory for more than a decade, and neither had forgotten it. But Thomas was, as always, a pragmatist. He attended Richard's coronation on the 6th of July, 1483, and carried the constable's mace. He accepted reappointment as steward of the household. He took the Knight of the Garter that Richard offered him, and he served on the new King's Council. To all outward appearances, Thomas Stanley was a loyal servant of the Yorkist crown, just as he had been under Edward IV. Margaret, however, was anything but loyal. In the autumn of 1483, she became deeply involved in a conspiracy known as Buckingham's Rebellion, a plot to overthrow Richard III and place Henry Tudor on the throne. The conspiracy was wide-reaching and remarkably ambitious. Margaret was at its heart, coordinating with sympathisers across southern England, communicating with her son in exile through secret channels, and working in concert with the Duke of Buckingham, a man who had initially supported Richard's seizure of power, but had since turned against him for reasons that remain debated by historians. The plan was for Buckingham to raise the west of England while Henry Tudor crossed from Brittany with an invasion force. The 2 armies would converge and Richard would be swept from the throne. It was a bold scheme and it very nearly worked. But the autumn storms that year were ferocious. Henry's fleet was scattered by gales in the English Channel, and Buckingham's forces, marching through Wales in torrential rain, were reduced by desertion and flooded rivers. Buckingham was captured and executed at Salisbury on the 2nd of November, 1483. The rebellion collapsed. Margaret was in grave danger. Her involvement in the conspiracy was well known. She had been in communication with Buckingham. She had sent money and messages to her son, and her physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, had acted as a go-between. Under normal circumstances, Margaret might have expected to face charges of treason and the consequences that followed: imprisonment, forfeiture of lands, perhaps even death. But Margaret Beaufort was protected by the one thing that had always protected the Stanleys: the fact that Thomas Stanley was too powerful to alienate. Richard III was not a fool. He knew that if he executed Margaret, he would lose Thomas. And losing Thomas meant losing Lancashire, the northwest, and the thousands of armed retainers who could tip the balance in any future conflict. So Richard chose a middle path. He stripped Margaret of her titles and estates and placed them in the hands of her husband, Thomas Stanley. with strict instructions to keep his wife confined and under control. Thomas was ordered to ensure that Margaret was held in some secret place at home and prevented from any further plotting. It was a solution that satisfied no one. Richard did not trust it. Margaret certainly did not intend to obey it. And Thomas probably understood that the arrangement was temporary, a holding pattern that would last only until the next crisis came. Whether Thomas actually carried out Richard's order is a matter of considerable doubt. Margaret continued to correspond with her son in exile, and there is every reason to believe that Thomas knew it. He may even have facilitated it. The channels of communication between Margaret at Lathom and Henry in Brittany remained open, and the planning for a second invasion attempt continued throughout 1484 and into the early months of 1485. Margaret was tireless, relentless, and utterly determined. She had been working toward this moment for her entire adult life. The moment when her only son would return to England and claim the crown that she believed was his by right. Thomas maintained the appearance of obedience to Richard, and Richard, who could not afford to antagonize the most powerful man in Lancashire, accepted the appearance. It was a dangerous game played by two men who understood each other's calculations perfectly and trusted each other not at all. The uneasy truce held through 1484 and into the early months of 1485. But Richard was watching. He noticed when Thomas asked permission to retire to his estates in Lancashire, away from the court. He noticed when rumours began to circulate that Henry Tudor was preparing to invade, and he took action. In the summer of 1485, Richard demanded that Thomas send his eldest son, George, Lord Strange, to court. The meaning was unmistakable. George was a hostage. If Thomas betrayed the king, George would die. Thomas complied. He sent his son to court, and he waited. He waited for the moment when he would have to make the one choice he had spent his entire career avoiding. That moment was coming. It was coming to a muddy field in Leicestershire on a warm August morning, and it would change the history of England forever. On the 7th of August, 1485, a fleet of ships appeared off the coast of Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest of Wales. Aboard the lead vessel was a man who had not set foot in England since he was a boy. His name was Henry Tudor, and he had come to take the crown. Henry was 28 years old. He had spent most of his life in exile, first in Brittany, then in France, sustained by the money, the prayers, and the tireless scheming of his mother, Margaret Beaufort. He had never commanded an army in battle. He had never governed a territory. His claim to the throne was thin, resting on his descent from John of Gaunt through the Beaufort line, a line that had been explicitly barred from the succession by Act of Parliament. But he was the last Lancastrian claimant standing, and in the chaotic world of 15th century English politics, that was enough. Henry landed at Mill Bay near the town of Dale with a force of roughly 2,000 men, a mix of English exiles, French mercenaries, and Scottish adventurers. It was a small army, far too small to challenge Richard III in open battle. Everything depended on gathering supporters as he marched through Wales and into England. Everything depended on the nobles of the realm choosing to join him. Henry's march through Wales was a journey of desperate hope. He moved northeast from Pembrokeshire through Cardigan and Aberystwyth, gathering a modest but growing stream of Welsh supporters. The Welsh had long memories and long loyalties, and Henry's connection to the Tudor family, the descendants of Owain Tudor, a Welshman who had married the widow of Henry V, gave him a certain romantic appeal. The poet Dafydd Llwyd had prophesied the coming of a Welsh hero who would reclaim the English throne, and Henry's supporters encouraged the comparison. But poetry would not win battles. Henry needed soldiers, and above all, he needed the Stanleys. And everything, above all, depended on them. Henry's stepfather, Thomas Stanley, controlled the northwest of England. His brother, Sir William Stanley, held castles and offices across Cheshire and North Wales, including the great castle of Holt near Wrexham, which sat directly on Henry's line of march. Between them, the Stanleys could put thousands of armed men into the field. If they fought for Henry, he had a chance. If they fought for Richard, he was finished. And if they did what Stanleys always did, if they waited and watched and refused to commit, then Henry would march into battle with a force so small that the outcome was almost certainly death. As Henry moved through Wales gathering a trickle of Welsh supporters, messages flew back and forth between the Tudor camp and the Stanley estates. Thomas Stanley was at his home in Lancashire. His brother William was at his castle of Holt near Wrexham. Both men were in communication with Henry, but neither would make a firm commitment. Thomas, in particular, was constrained by the fact that his son George was in Richard's hands. If Thomas declared for Henry, George would be killed, or so Richard had threatened. The question of what the Stanleys would do hung over the march like a thundercloud. Henry's commanders discussed it around their campfires at night. Richard's spies reported on every rumour and every movement from the Stanley estates. And the Stanleys themselves, Thomas at Lathom, William at Holt, played the most dangerous waiting game of their careers. At some point during the march, Henry is believed to have met secretly with the Stanleys, either with Thomas, or with William, or with both. The details of these meetings, if they occurred, are shrouded in uncertainty. We know only the outcome. The Stanleys gave Henry encouragement, but no binding promise. They would come to the battlefield, they would bring their men, but they would not commit, not openly, not until they could see which way the wind was blowing. It was the Stanley way. It had always been the Stanley way, and it must have driven Henry Tudor nearly mad with anxiety. There is a story, it may be truth or it may be tradition, that Thomas Stanley sent 4 knights to serve in Henry's bodyguard as a gesture of good faith. These were Sir Robert Tunstall, Sir John Savage, who was Thomas's nephew, Sir Hugh Purcell, and Sir Humphrey Stanley. It was a small contribution in military terms, but it carried a symbolic weight. The Stanleys were signalling, without declaring, that their sympathies lay with the Tudor cause. Sir John Savage was given command of the left flank of Henry's army, a position of honour and responsibility that would have been unthinkable without Stanley approval. Richard III, meanwhile, was not idle. He was at Nottingham Castle, gathering his own forces, and he was watching the Stanleys with a mixture of suspicion and anxiety. He knew that the Stanleys held the balance of power. He knew that Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, the mother of his enemy. And he knew that the Stanleys had a long and well-documented history of switching sides at the most convenient moment. Richard summoned Thomas Stanley to join the royal army. Thomas replied that he was ill with the sweating sickness, a common excuse that fooled no one. Richard then summoned William Stanley, who also made excuses. The king was furious, but he was also trapped. He could not march against the Stanleys without dividing his own forces and leaving himself vulnerable to Henry Tudor. He could not execute George Stanley without driving Thomas definitively into the Tudor camp. All he could do was hold his hostage, maintain his threats, and hope that the Stanleys' legendary caution would keep them on the sidelines. By the middle of August, the 3 forces were converging on the Midlands. Richard moved south from Nottingham with a large army, perhaps 10,000 men, though estimates vary. Henry moved east from Wales with his much smaller force, which had grown to perhaps 5,000 with the addition of Welsh and English volunteers. And the Stanleys, Thomas and William, each with their own retinue, positioned themselves between the other 2 armies, within striking distance of both, but committed to neither. On the night of the 21st of August 1485, the eve of battle, 3 camps lay within a few miles of each other near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard held the high ground on Ambion Hill, a rising knoll that commanded the marshy plain below. His camp was large and well provisioned, and his soldiers knew that they outnumbered their enemy. Henry held a position to the west, on lower ground, with a force that was brave but desperately small. His men knew that the coming day would decide everything: their lives, their fortunes, and the future of the English crown. And the Stanleys held a position to the north, perhaps a mile or 2 from the main battlefield. Close enough to intervene, far enough to observe, and perfectly placed to tip the balance whichever way they chose. Their campfires would have been visible from both the other camps, a silent reminder to Richard and Henry alike that the fate of England was not in their hands alone. The night must have been long for all 3 commanders. Richard, who was by all accounts a brave man and a capable soldier, knew that the Stanleys were his greatest vulnerability. He had tried everything: threats, hostage-taking, promises, to secure their loyalty, and none of it had worked. Henry, who had never fought a battle in his life, knew that his survival depended on men whose commitment he could not verify. And Thomas Stanley, lying in his tent with the weight of 3 decades of careful calculation pressing down upon him, knew that the morning would bring the one moment he had spent his entire career trying to avoid: the moment of irrevocable choice. Richard made one final attempt to secure the Stanleys' loyalty. He sent a messenger to Thomas's camp with a blunt warning: "Join me in the morning, or your son George dies before the battle is done." The reply that came back has become one of the most famous lines in English history, though it rests on tradition rather than documented fact. Thomas Stanley, so the story goes, sent the messenger back with the words, "Tell the king that I have other sons." Whether he actually said it, we cannot be certain, but the defiance it expressed was real. Thomas Stanley had made his calculation, and he was not going to fight for Richard III. On the morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field began. Richard III drew up his army in a strong position on Ambion Hill, overlooking the marshy plain below. He divided his forces into 3 divisions. One was commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, a loyal Yorkist veteran. Another was held in reserve under the Earl of Northumberland, a man whose own loyalty was far from certain. The third, the largest, was commanded by Richard himself. Henry Tudor's army was smaller and less experienced. He placed the bulk of his forces under the command of the Earl of Oxford, a seasoned Lancastrian commander who had spent years in exile and imprisonment. Henry kept a small bodyguard around himself and stayed behind the main line. And off to the side, watching and waiting, were the Stanley forces. Perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 men, a force large enough to decide the outcome of the battle on its own. The fighting began when Norfolk's division engaged Oxford's men. It was a hard, grinding struggle, fought on foot with bills and halberds and swords. The 2 sides pushed and shoved and hacked at each other across the muddy ground, and for a time, neither could gain the advantage. Norfolk himself was killed in the fighting, a blow to the Yorkist cause. Richard watched from Ambion Hill. He could see that the battle was not going as he had hoped. Norfolk was dead. Northumberland on the other side of the hill had not moved. Whether out of treachery or caution, no one could say. And the Stanleys were still sitting on the sidelines, their banners visible but their intentions unknown. Then Richard made the decision that would define his place in history. He spotted Henry Tudor. The Tudor claimant was visible behind the main battle line, surrounded by a small group of bodyguards and standard-bearers. He was exposed. He was vulnerable. And if Richard could reach him and kill him, the battle, the war, the whole question of the English succession would be settled in a single stroke. Richard gathered his household knights around him. perhaps 1,000 of the best armoured, best trained cavalry in England. And he launched a charge. It was a bold, reckless, magnificent gamble. The King of England in full armour riding at the head of his personal guard, thundering across the field directly at his rival. The charge struck Henry's bodyguard with terrible force. Richard himself killed Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, cutting him down with his own hand. He unhorsed Sir John Cheney, one of the largest and strongest knights in England. He fought his way closer and closer to Henry Tudor, hacking at the men who stood between him and victory. For a moment, a long, terrifying moment, it seemed as though Richard would succeed. Henry's bodyguard was being overwhelmed. The Tudor claimant was in mortal danger. And then Sir William Stanley moved. William Stanley, who had been watching the battle unfold from his position on the flank with growing tension, made the decision that would define the rest of his life and end it. He gave the order to charge. His men, roughly 3,000 of them mounted and armed and ready, crashed into the side of Richard's cavalry charge like a wave breaking against a rock. The impact was devastating. Richard's household knights, who had been on the verge of reaching Henry Tudor and cutting him down, were suddenly engulfed from the side by a fresh force of cavalry that outnumbered them and struck them at full gallop. Horses screamed and stumbled. Men were thrown from their saddles. The tight formation of Richard's charge, the wedge of steel and fury that had been driving toward Henry, shattered under the weight of William's intervention. Knights who had been fighting side by side moments earlier were separated, surrounded, and overwhelmed. The momentum of the charge was broken. The king's men were cut down around him one by one as William Stanley's soldiers pressed in from every direction. The ground, already churned and muddy from the morning's fighting, became a killing floor. Richard III fought on. He fought with a courage and a fury that even his enemies would later acknowledge. He refused to flee when his men begged him to. He refused to surrender. He died on the field, still swinging his sword, the last King of England to fall in battle. It was over. When the fighting stopped and the dust began to settle, someone found a circlet of gold lying on the field, the crown that Richard had worn into battle. According to tradition, it was found beneath a hawthorn bush, though this detail may be a later embellishment. The crown was brought to Thomas Stanley, and Thomas Stanley, the man who had spent his entire career avoiding commitment, who had sat on the sidelines at Blore Heath and hedged his bets through 3 decades of civil war, who had watched the Battle of Bosworth from a safe distance while his brother did the fighting. Thomas Stanley lifted the crown of England and placed it upon the head of Henry Tudor. The moment must have been extraordinary. Picture it, the August sun, now high in a sky streaked with smoke, the field littered with the dead and the dying, the shouts of the victors and the groans of the vanquished, the smell of blood and horses and churned earth, and in the midst of it all, a circle of gold, dented perhaps, and smeared with mud, but unmistakable in its meaning, being placed upon the head of a man who, just hours before, had been an exile with a thin claim and a small army. Thomas Stanley's hands, steady and deliberate, performing the most significant act of royal investiture since the coronation of William the Conqueror 4 centuries earlier. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, Thomas Stanley's stepson, the soldiers who witnessed the scene, Thomas's retainers, Henry's bodyguard, the survivors of both armies who had gathered to see the outcome, let out a great cheer. "God save King Henry," they cried, and the sound carried across the fields of Leicestershire and into the annals of English history. It was the most consequential act of the Wars of the Roses, and it was performed by a man who had spent the battle doing nothing. The Stanleys had waited until the very last moment, watched the tide turn, and then claimed credit for the victory. It was, depending on your point of view, either the most brilliant or the most cynical act of political timing in English history. There is a tradition, beloved of storytellers and chroniclers, though not universally accepted by modern historians, that the crown Richard had worn into battle was found beneath a hawthorn bush on the edge of the field. The hawthorn, with its thorny branches and its white spring blossoms, became a symbol of the Tudor dynasty. It appeared on coins, on heraldic devices, and in the propaganda of the new regime. Whether the detail is true or embroidered, it has the ring of poetic justice. A crown hidden among thorns, waiting to be found by the right hands at the right moment. It was a very Stanley kind of metaphor. George Stanley, Thomas's son, survived the battle. Richard's order for his execution had been given, but in the chaos of the fight, the men tasked with carrying it out had not done so. George escaped, rejoined his father, and lived to see the new dynasty established. The Stanleys had gambled everything, and they had won. The rewards came quickly. Henry VII, now securely on the throne, was generous to the family that had placed the crown on his head, even if their contribution to the actual fighting had been somewhat ambiguous. Thomas Stanley was confirmed in all his existing offices: Steward of the Household, Constable of England, Lord of the Isle of Man. And to these was added a title that would define the family for centuries to come. In October 1485, Thomas Stanley was created Earl of Derby. The choice of title was significant. The Stanleys held their principal estates in the hundred of West Derby, near Liverpool, and the Earldom of Derby connected them permanently to the landscape of Lancashire. It was a grand title, one of the great earldoms of England, and it carried with it a precedence and prestige that the mere barony of Stanley could never have matched. Thomas was also made Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, giving him formal authority over the very territory he already dominated in practice. His wife, Margaret Beaufort, was restored to her full dignity and given the extraordinary title of My Lady the King's Mother, a position that granted her precedence over every woman in England except the Queen. She signed her letters Margaret Earl, Margaret Regina, indicating her quasi-royal status. Sir William Stanley, whose charge at Bosworth had actually decided the battle, was rewarded with the office of Lord Chamberlain and the Chamberlainship of the Exchequer. He was granted extensive lands across England and Wales, including properties that had belonged to executed Yorkists. William became, almost overnight, one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. His personal fortune was rumoured to be enormous. Some contemporaries claimed he possessed treasure worth 40,000 marks, a staggering sum that placed him among the richest subjects in England. William used his wealth lavishly. He maintained a great household dressed in the finest clothes and lived in a style that rivaled many of the peers of the realm. He held his offices with energy and competence, and he seems to have enjoyed the material rewards of power in a way that his more cautious brother Thomas never did. Where Thomas hoarded influence quietly, William displayed it openly. It was a difference in temperament that would, in the end, prove fatal. The Stanley brothers were at the summit of their power. Thomas was the stepfather of the king. William was the man who had saved the king's life on the battlefield. Between them, they controlled the northwest of England, the Isle of Man, and a substantial portion of the royal government. No family in England had risen so far, so fast, or from such unpromising beginnings. But the very quality that had brought the Stanleys to power, their willingness to switch sides when it suited them, now haunted them. Henry VII was not a trusting man. He had lived in exile for most of his life, surrounded by betrayal and intrigue, and he understood better than anyone that loyalty bought with rewards could be sold to a higher bidder. He watched the Stanleys carefully. He was grateful, but he was not naive. For 9 years after Bosworth, the arrangement held. Thomas continued to serve as a loyal and efficient magnate, managing the northwest and attending court. William enjoyed his new wealth and offices, living in considerable state at his various castles and manors. The family seemed secure. Then, in late 1494, everything fell apart. A young man named Perkin Warbeck had appeared in Europe, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared in the Tower of London in 1483. If his claim was genuine, then Warbeck was the rightful heir to the Yorkist throne, and Henry VII was a usurper. Warbeck had already attracted the support of several European rulers, including the King of Scotland and the Duchess of Burgundy, and he was preparing to invade England. Henry VII took the threat seriously. His spies were everywhere, and they uncovered a network of English nobles who had been in contact with Warbeck. Among them, to the king's shock and fury, was Sir William Stanley. The evidence was not overwhelming. An informant named Robert Clifford reported that William had said in a private conversation that if Warbeck was truly the son of Edward IV, then William would not take up arms against him. It was a conditional statement, not a declaration of support, but a refusal to rule out the possibility of support. Polydore Virgil, the contemporary historian, would later write that William's words indicated lukewarmness towards King Henry rather than treason. But for Henry VII, lukewarmness was enough. A man who would not commit to fighting a pretender was a man who might, at the critical moment, switch sides. Just as William had switched sides at Bosworth, Henry could not afford to keep such a man in his government. William was arrested in late 1494 and charged with treason. The charges were based largely on the testimony of Robert Clifford, an informant who had been in contact with the Warbeck conspirators and who now turned King's evidence in exchange for a pardon. Clifford's testimony was detailed enough to be dangerous but circumstantial enough to be debatable. William, Clifford said, had sent a mission to Warbeck to discover whether the pretender was truly the son of Edward IV. He had discussed the matter with Clifford and others, and he had made the fateful statement that if Warbeck was genuinely Edward's son, he would not take up arms against him. By modern standards, the evidence against William was thin. He had not joined Warbeck. He had not raised troops against Henry. He had not done anything more than express a conditional willingness to reconsider his loyalties, which was, in a sense, exactly what the Stanleys had been doing for decades. But the difference was that this time, the king was listening, and the king was not inclined to take chances. William was tried on the 6th and 7th of February, 1495. The trial was presided over by Thomas Stanley, his own brother, in Thomas's capacity as Constable of England. Imagine for a moment the scene. Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derby, the most powerful man in Lancashire, sitting in judgment on his own younger brother, the brother who had charged across the field at Bosworth and saved Henry Tudor's life, the brother who had fought at Blore Heath, at Towton, at Tewkesbury, always on the Yorkist side, always willing to draw his sword when Thomas was not, the brother who had captured Margaret of Anjou and who had been rewarded with the highest offices in the land. Now that brother was standing before him, accused of the same kind of disloyalty that the Stanleys had practiced as a family art for generations. What passed between them in that courtroom, we do not know. Whether Thomas argued privately for mercy, whether he begged the king to spare his brother's life, whether he felt any pang of conscience or any flicker of grief, all of this is lost to us. Thomas Stanley left nothing of his inner life in the historical record. He was a man who kept his thoughts behind walls thicker than those of Lathom House, and no historian has ever breached them. William reportedly admitted the offence, hoping that a full confession would earn him mercy. Henry VII was initially inclined to spare his life, partly out of gratitude for Bosworth, and partly to avoid antagonizing his mother and stepfather. but the king's counsellors persuaded him that clemency would only encourage other potential conspirators. If a man as powerful as William Stanley could flirt with treason and walk away unpunished, then no man's loyalty could be relied upon. The man who had saved Henry Tudor's life would have to die. On the 16th of February, 1495, Sir William Stanley was beheaded on Tower Hill. His vast estates were confiscated by the Crown. His titles were stripped. The man who had decided the Battle of Bosworth, who had broken Richard's charge and placed the crown on Henry's head, died a convicted traitor, 10 years after his greatest triumph. Thomas Stanley survived, as Thomas Stanley always survived. His brother's execution does not appear to have shaken his own position. He continued to serve as Earl of Derby, as Constable of England, and as the undisputed master of the North West. Whether he felt grief, guilt, or relief at William's death, no record tells us. Thomas was not a man who left his feelings in the historical record. The years after William's execution were quiet ones for the Earl of Derby. Thomas was now in his 60s, an old man by the standards of the 15th century. He spent most of his time at his estates in Lancashire, attending to his affairs and his devotions. His wife, Margaret Beaufort, remained at court, wielding enormous influence as the king's mother. In 1503, Thomas suffered a personal blow that no amount of political skill could have prevented. His eldest son and heir, George, Lord Strange, died, just months before Thomas himself. George had been the young man whose life had hung in the balance at Bosworth, the hostage whose fate had been part of Thomas's terrible calculation on the morning of the battle. He had survived that ordeal, had lived to see the Tudor dynasty established, had married and fathered children of his own. And now he was gone, taken by illness or accident. The records do not tell us which, at an age when he should have had decades of life ahead of him. Thomas, now nearly 70, was left without a direct heir. The old Earl spent his final months at Lathom House, the great house that had been the centre of Stanley power since the days of Sir John and Isabel Lathom. He was a man at the end of a very long road. He had seen 5 kings upon the throne of England. He had served Lancaster and York, had watched the kingmaker rise and fall, had married the most dangerous woman in England and helped her son take the crown. He had sat in judgment on his own brother and watched him go to his death. He had outlived his wives, his rivals, his enemies, and now his own son. On the 28th of July, 1504, the day before his death, Thomas Stanley dictated his will. It is a remarkable document, not for its legal provisions, which were standard for a nobleman of his rank, but for one small, telling detail. Among the usual bequests and instructions, Thomas ordered that masses should be said for the souls of himself, his wives, his parents, his ancestors, his children, his siblings, and, in a characteristically Stanley touch, them that have died in the service of my lord, my father, or of me. It was a gesture of lordly obligation, the acknowledgement of a debt owed to those who had followed the Stanley banner into danger. It was also perhaps the closest Thomas Stanley ever came to expressing something like guilt. How many men had died in his service? How many had been left on fields where Thomas himself had refused to fight? We cannot know. But the will suggests that Thomas, at the very end, was counting them. On the 29th of July, 1504, Thomas Stanley, 1st Earl of Derby, died at Lathom House in Lancashire. He was about 69 years old. His body was carried to Burscough Priory, near Ormskirk, and buried in the family chapel alongside his parents and ancestors. In his will, dated the day before his death, he ordered masses for the souls of himself, his wives, his parents, his ancestors, his children, his siblings, and, in a characteristically Stanley touch, them that have died in the service of my lord, my father, or of me. He was succeeded as Earl of Derby by his grandson, Thomas, the 2nd Earl. the son of the late George, Lord Strange. Thomas Stanley, the first Earl of Derby, had entered the world as the heir to a Lancashire barony and the kingship of a small island. He left it as one of the most powerful noblemen in England, the stepfather of a king, and the man who had placed the crown of England on a new dynasty's head. He had achieved all of this not through courage on the battlefield. He had never, so far as we know, struck a blow in anger during the entire Wars of the Roses, but through an almost inhuman patience, an unwillingness to commit until the outcome was certain, and a political instinct so refined that it bordered on genius. His critics called him a traitor, a coward, and a turncoat. His admirers, if he had any, called him a survivor. The truth, as with so many things in the story of the Stanleys, was somewhere in between. He was buried alongside the bones of the family that had risen from obscurity to kingship in just 4 generations. And the house he had built, the House of Stanley, the Earls of Derby, was only just beginning. The earldom of Derby passed smoothly from the first Earl to his grandson, and then onward through the generations. The second Earl, Thomas, lived quietly and died in 1521. The third Earl, Edward, made a change that was more symbolic than political, but worth noting. He ceased to use the title King of Man and instead adopted the more modest style of Lord of Man. The reasons are not entirely clear, but it may have reflected a growing sensitivity to the idea that an English nobleman should not claim a royal title that might seem to rival the crown. The Stanleys were powerful, but they had learned from the example of William Stanley's execution, if nothing else, that it did not pay to appear too grand. The fourth Earl, Henry Stanley, held the title from 1572 to 1593 and was a man of considerable culture and influence. He served as a diplomat and politician, but he is perhaps best remembered for his patronage of the arts. The Stanley household at Knowsley and Lathom was one of the great centres of Elizabethan entertainment, and Henry kept players, acting companies that performed for the family and their guests during the long winter evenings. His household steward, Sir William Farrington of Worden Hall, kept meticulous records, and from his accounts we know that the leading acting companies of the day performed regularly at the Stanley residences. The Queen's men, the Earl of Leicester's men, the Earl of Essex's men, all made the journey to Lancashire to perform for the Stanleys. But it was Henry's eldest son, Ferdinando, who would become the most culturally significant Stanley of them all, and whose death would become one of the most mysterious episodes in the family's history. Ferdinando Stanley was born around 1559. He was known during his father's lifetime as Lord Strange, a title derived from one of the family's many subsidiary baronies. And he was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary gifts. He was educated at the University of Oxford, called to court by Queen Elizabeth I to be shaped in good manners, and summoned to Parliament at a young age. He married Alice Spencer, the youngest daughter of Sir John Spencer of Althorp, a family that would, centuries later, produce Diana, Princess of Wales. Ferdinando loved the theatre above all other pursuits. He was a patron of writers and poets, and he supported many of the finest literary talents of the Elizabethan age: Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and, most significantly of all, a young man from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare. The connection between the Stanleys and the English theatre is one of the most fascinating threads in the family's long history. It had begun in the previous generation when Henry Stanley, the fourth Earl, had kept acting companies at his great houses in Lancashire. The household steward, Sir William Farrington of Worden Hall, kept meticulous notebooks recording every expense and every visitor, and from his accounts we know that the leading acting companies of the age, the Queen's men, the Earl of Leicester's men, the Earl of Essex's men, all made the long journey to Lancashire to perform for the Stanley family. The great halls of Knowsley and Lathom rang with the sound of plays and music during the long winter evenings, and it was in this atmosphere of cultural generosity that Ferdinando had grown up. When Ferdinando came of age, he took the family's theatrical patronage to an entirely new level. Lord Strange's Men, the acting company that bore his title, was one of the most important playing companies in England during the late 1580s and early 1590s. The troupe included several actors who would later become the core of Shakespeare's own company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men: Edward Alleyn, the great tragedian, George Bryan, Augustine Phillips, Thomas Pope, John Heminges, who would later help compile the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, and William Kempe, the famous clown. These men performed at the theatre in Shoreditch, England's first purpose-built playhouse, and later at the Rose Theatre on Bankside, and they staged some of the earliest works that would establish the English theatre as a force in world literature. The diary of Philip Henslow, the proprietor of the Rose Theatre, records that on the 3rd of March, 1592, Lord Strange's Men performed a play identified as Harry the Vi, Henry VI, which was almost certainly Shakespeare's history play about the Wars of the Roses. It is a dizzying thought. The actors employed by a descendant of the very family that had decided the outcome of the Wars of the Roses were now performing a dramatization of those wars on a stage in London for paying audiences. The connections between history and theatre, between the Stanleys and the stage, were woven so tightly that they can scarcely be untangled. Shakespeare himself is believed to have been a member of Lord Strange's Men. The troupe produced the trilogy of Henry VI plays and Titus Andronicus, early works that announce Shakespeare's arrival as a dramatist of ambition and power. Some scholars have suggested that the Henry VI plays contain oblique references to the Stanley family's own political position, a possibility that is tantalizing even if it cannot be proven. When Ferdinando's father, the 4th Earl, died on the 25th of September, 1593, Ferdinando succeeded him as the 5th Earl of Derby. Lord Strange's Men were renamed Derby's Men, and the new Earl continued his patronage of the arts. He was, by all accounts, a man of exalted genius as well as birth, admired for his intelligence, his generosity, and his cultural sophistication. But Ferdinando Stanley carried a burden that no amount of talent or charm could lighten. Through his mother, Lady Margaret Clifford, he was descended from Mary Tudor, the younger sister of King Henry VIII. This bloodline gave Ferdinando a place in the line of succession to the English throne, a succession that was, in the 1590s, one of the most sensitive and dangerous questions in English politics. Queen Elizabeth I was 60 years old, unmarried and childless. She had refused to name a successor, and her silence on the matter had created a vacuum that attracted conspirators, plotters, and would-be kingmakers from across Europe. Catholic exiles in particular saw the succession as an opportunity to restore their faith to England, and they looked for candidates who might be sympathetic, or at least malleable. The stakes could not have been higher. If Elizabeth died without a named heir, England might plunge into the kind of civil war that had devastated the country a century earlier during the Wars of the Roses. Catholic powers on the continent, Spain in particular, might intervene. The carefully constructed Protestant settlement that had defined Elizabeth's reign might be overturned. The succession was not merely a political question, it was an existential one for the English state. Ferdinando Stanley, with his royal blood and his position as one of the greatest noblemen in the north, was an obvious target for those who hoped to shape the succession. In September 1593, just days after Ferdinando had become Earl, a man named Richard Hesketh arrived at the Stanley residences. Hesketh was an exile, a Lancashire gentleman who had been living abroad among the communities of English Catholics on the continent. The Heskeths were an old Lancashire family, long connected to the Stanleys, and Richard Hesketh had been chosen for his mission precisely because he was a familiar face, someone who could approach the new Earl without arousing immediate suspicion. He came with a message from a group of Catholic conspirators, and his mission was deceptively simple. He was to persuade Ferdinando to lead a rebellion against Elizabeth and claim the throne. The conspirators had reason to believe that Ferdinando might be receptive. His claim to the succession was real, and his position in the north gave him the military resources to mount a serious challenge. But they had misjudged their man. Ferdinando was not a political schemer. He was a patron of the arts, a lover of the theatre, and a man who had no appetite whatsoever for the kind of desperate gamble that the conspirators were proposing. Ferdinando met with Hesketh twice. The details of their conversations are not fully known, but the outcome is clear. Ferdinando rejected the proposal outright. He was a loyal Protestant, a loyal subject of the Queen, and he had no intention of risking everything on a Catholic conspiracy that was likely to end in disaster. He reported Hesketh's mission to the authorities, and Hesketh was arrested, interrogated, tried for treason, and executed on the 29th of November, 1593. Ferdinando had done the right thing. He had refused the plot and turned in the conspirator. He should have been safe. He was not. On the 5th of April, 1594, less than 6 months after Hesketh's execution, Ferdinando was suddenly taken ill at Knowsley Hall. He began vomiting violently, the contents of his stomach described by witnesses as the colour of soot or rusty iron. The illness came on with terrifying speed and ferocity. Ferdinando's body seemed to be convulsing from within, racked by pains that left him unable to stand or speak clearly. His doctors were summoned, but they could do nothing. The medicines and remedies of the 16th century were helpless against what appeared to be a powerful toxin working its way through the Earl's body. The historian John Stow recorded Ferdinando's illness in great detail, and the account makes harrowing reading even after 4 centuries. Ferdinando, in his agony, became convinced that he had been bewitched. A common explanation for sudden, unexplained illness in the 16th century, and one that reflects the depth of his suffering and his confusion about its cause. As the days passed and his condition worsened, he reportedly asked his doctors to stop treating him, saying that he knew he was dying and that nothing they could do would save him. His family gathered around him, his wife Alice, his daughters, his servants and retainers. The entire household of one of the greatest noblemen in England drew close as their lord slipped away. The atmosphere at Lathom House in those final days must have been one of terrible grief, compounded by suspicion and fear. Someone had done this. Someone had poisoned the 5th Earl of Derby. But who? On the 16th of April, 1594, Ferdinando Stanley, 5th Earl of Derby, died at Lathom House. He was about 34 years old. He was buried at Ormskirk, near the family's traditional resting place, at the now-dissolved Burscough Priory. His death sent shockwaves through the political world. The succession question was suddenly more urgent than ever, and the circumstances of Ferdinando's death were deeply suspicious. Poisoning was widely suspected. The Jesuits were blamed in the rumours that swept the country, and Ferdinando's gentleman of the horse, the man responsible for his personal arrangements, was accused of administering the poison. The suspect reportedly fled on one of the Earl's best horses, and he was never caught. A later analysis published in the medical journal The Lancet in 2001 examined the evidence and concluded that poisoning was indeed the most likely cause of death. The article pointed to arsenic or poisonous mushrooms as possible agents, and suggested that the plot may have been connected to the network of Catholic exiles who had sent Hesketh. Some historians have implicated a different William Stanley, not the brother of the first Earl, but a distant kinsman named William Stanley of Houghton, who was deeply involved in anti-Elizabethan conspiracies abroad. This William may have seen Ferdinando's rejection of the Hesketh mission as a personal betrayal and arranged his murder in revenge. The truth may never be known. What is certain is that Ferdinando's death at the age of 34 robbed England of one of its finest cultural patrons and plunged the Stanley family into a period of uncertainty. Ferdinando left no sons, only 3 daughters, and the earldom passed to his younger brother William, who became the 6th Earl of Derby. The succession dispute that followed between Ferdinando's daughters, who claimed certain subsidiary titles, and his brother, who inherited the earldom, would drag on for years and further complicate the family's affairs. But the most far-reaching consequence of Ferdinando's death was one that no one could have foreseen at the time. The core members of Lord Strange's men, suddenly without a patron and a company name, were forced to reorganise. They needed a new protector, a new name, and a new structure. Within months they had found all 3. The actors who had performed under the Stanley banner, Hemingers, Kempe, Bryan, Phillips, Pope, and the young playwright from Stratford, reformed as the Lord Chamberlain's men under the patronage of Henry Carey, the first Baron Hunsdon, who held the office of Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain's men would become, within a very short time, the most important theatrical company in the history of the English language. They would build the Globe Theatre on Bankside in 1599. They would stage the premieres of Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, The Tempest, and dozens of other plays that would change the course of world literature. When James I came to the throne in 1603, the company would be taken under royal patronage and renamed the King's Men, the highest honour an acting company could receive. None of this might have happened, or at least not in the way it did if Ferdinando Stanley had lived. If the 5th Earl of Derby had survived to a natural old age, Lord Strange's men might have continued under his patronage indefinitely, performing at Knowsley and Lathom and touring the provinces, and the actors who formed the core of the company might never have needed to reorganise in London under a different patron. The chain of events that led from Ferdinando's death to the Lord Chamberlain's men, to the Globe Theatre, to the greatest body of dramatic literature in any language. That chain began with a poisoned cup in a Lancashire manor house in the spring of 1594. It is one of the quieter ironies of English history that Shakespeare's career was shaped in part by the murder of a Stanley. The 17th century brought a new kind of crisis to the House of Stanley, one that would test the family not through the subtle arts of political manoeuvring, but through fire and blood and siege. The 6th Earl, William, died in 1642, the very year that England plunged into civil war. His successor, James Stanley, the 7th Earl of Derby, was a man of very different temperament from his ancestor Thomas, the 1st Earl. Where the 1st Earl had perfected the art of neutrality, James threw himself wholeheartedly into the royalist cause. He was the most powerful supporter of King Charles I in the northwest of England, and he used his wealth, his influence, and his ancient authority as Lord of Man to raise men and money for the king. James Stanley's wife was a woman named Charlotte de la Trémoille, a French noblewoman born in 1599 at the Château of Thouars in Poitou. Charlotte was the daughter of the Duke of Thouars and the granddaughter of William the Silent, the founder of Dutch independence. She had married James Stanley in 1626, and she had given him 9 children, 5 sons and 4 daughters. She was a woman of formidable will, deep religious conviction, and absolute fearlessness, and the events of 1644 would prove it beyond any doubt. In 1643, King Charles ordered the Earl of Derby to fortify the Isle of Man against a possible Scottish invasion, and then to join the northern campaign. James obeyed, leaving Lathom House, the ancient seat of the Stanleys, the place where Sir John Stanley had first established the family's power in Lancashire, in the care of his wife. Charlotte found herself in an impossible situation. The parliamentarian forces controlled most of Lancashire, and Lathom House was now the last royalist stronghold in the county. Sir Thomas Fairfax, the parliamentarian general, saw the Earl's absence as an opportunity and sent envoys to demand Charlotte's surrender. Charlotte refused. She refused politely, she refused firmly, and she refused with a contempt that the parliamentarian commanders found deeply aggravating. When Fairfax obtained a letter from the Earl himself requesting safe passage for his wife, Charlotte dismissed it. She would not surrender her husband's house. She would not acknowledge Parliament's authority. She would not leave. In February 1644, Fairfax laid siege to Lathom House with approximately 2,000 soldiers, 500 cavalry, and 1,500 infantry. Charlotte had a garrison of just 300 men. But Lathom House was not an ordinary manor. It was a fortress. Its outer walls were 6 feet thick. It was surrounded by a moat 8 yards wide. It had 9 towers, each armed with 6 cannons, 3 pointing in each direction, and a great central tower called the Eagle Tower, which provided a commanding view of the entire surrounding countryside. The house sat at the lowest point in an open expanse of flat land, which meant that Charlotte's garrison could see the enemy's movements from miles away. Charlotte had assembled a militia of experienced marksmen, and she put them to devastating use. Her sharpshooters picked off parliamentarian soldiers from the towers with lethal accuracy, inflicting steady casualties that sapped the besiegers' morale. The Eagle Tower, with its commanding view of the flat, open landscape around the house, gave Charlotte's observers a clear sight of every enemy movement. Parliamentarian attempts to dig approach trenches were spotted early and disrupted by sorties before they could be completed. Charlotte organised these sorties, sudden fierce raids out of the gates, with a tactical skill that impressed even her enemies. Her men would burst from the house under cover of darkness or poor weather, fall upon the enemy's positions, spike their cannon, capture their supplies, and retreat behind the walls before a counterattack could be organised. On one occasion, Charlotte's garrison captured an entire mortar, a heavy siege weapon that the parliamentarians had been using to bombard the house, and dragged it back inside the gates as a trophy. It was a humiliation for the besieging forces and a morale-boosting triumph for the defenders. The psychological warfare was just as fierce as the physical combat. Parliamentarian ministers and preachers were sent to harangue Charlotte, calling her the Scarlet Whore and the Whore of Babylon, and demanding that she submit to the will of God and Parliament. Charlotte received these insults with magnificent indifference. When Fairfax sent emissaries to negotiate her surrender, she received them as honoured guests, serving them refreshments, treating them with perfect courtesy, and then flatly refusing every one of their demands. On one occasion, she invited Fairfax himself to visit Lathom House for negotiations. He came, was received with elaborate hospitality, and found that the entire household, from the countess to the lowliest servant, categorically rejected his terms. When Fairfax sent a final ultimatum giving Charlotte 2 days to surrender, the messenger who returned 2 days later was, in the words of one contemporary account, scornfully dismissed. She maintained discipline within the garrison, kept spirits high, and refused, again and again, every offer of surrender. The siege lasted for 3 months. 3 months of bombardment, of sniping, of sorties and counterattacks, of hunger and cold, and the grinding pressure of being outnumbered nearly 7 to 1. 3 months during which Charlotte de la Trémoille, a French-born noblewoman in her mid-40s, a mother of 9, a woman who had been raised in the chateau of Poitou, held her ground against one of the finest commanders in the parliamentary army. On the 27th of May, 1644, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the dashing nephew of King Charles, arrived in Lancashire with a royalist relief force. He defeated the parliamentarian forces and broke the siege of Lathom House. Charlotte de la Trémoille had held out for 3 months with 300 men against 2,000. She had not surrendered a single wall, a single tower, or a single inch of ground. It was one of the most remarkable feats of resistance in the entire English Civil War, and it made Charlotte a legend. But the story of Lathom House did not end happily. Prince Rupert, recognizing that the house could not be defended indefinitely, insisted that Charlotte and her household evacuate to the Isle of Man. Charlotte reluctantly agreed, and she departed with her children for the safety of the island. In 1645, Lathom House was besieged again, this time by a larger parliamentarian force of 4,000 men under General Egerton. Without Charlotte's leadership and with a professional garrison in place, the defenders held out for several months, but were eventually forced to surrender. The parliamentarians demolished the fortifications. They pulled down the towers, breached the walls, and left Lathom House in ruins. The ancient seat of the Stanleys, the house where Isabel Lathom had brought her inheritance to Sir John Stanley, where Thomas I, Earl, had plotted and schemed, where Henry VII had been entertained as a guest of his stepfather, was gone. The fate of the 7th Earl was equally tragic. James Stanley continued to fight for the royalist cause with a devotion that his ancestor Thomas, the 1st Earl, would have found incomprehensible. Where Thomas had spent his life avoiding commitment, James threw himself into battle after battle, raising troops in Lancashire and leading them in a series of increasingly desperate campaigns. He fought at the Battle of Bolton in 1644, where his forces stormed the town in a fierce assault that left hundreds dead. He fought on the Isle of Man, maintaining the island as a royalist stronghold long after the mainland had been lost. And in 1651, when the young King Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, made his doomed attempt to reclaim the English throne, James Stanley was at his side. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September, 1651, the last major battle of the English Civil War. Cromwell's forces overwhelmed the royalist army, and the young king fled into hiding, eventually escaping to France after his famous adventure, hiding in an oak tree. James Stanley was not so fortunate. He was captured after the battle and brought to Bolton for trial. The choice of Bolton as the location for his trial was deliberate and cruel. It was at Bolton, 7 years earlier, that Stanley's royalist forces had stormed the town and killed hundreds of its inhabitants. The people of Bolton had not forgotten, and Parliament chose to try him there as a pointed act of retribution. James Stanley was found guilty of treason against Parliament and sentenced to death. He faced his fate with a composure and dignity that even his enemies acknowledged. He refused to beg for mercy. He declared his loyalty to the king. He commended his soul to God. And on the 15th of October, 1651, James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, was beheaded at Bolton. He was 44 years old. Charlotte survived her husband by 13 years. She lived on the Isle of Man for a time, attempting to use the island as a bargaining chip for her husband's life. A gamble that failed and provoked a local revolt. She died on the 31st of March, 1664, having outlived her husband, her home, and the cause for which they had both sacrificed so much. The destruction of Lathom House forced the Stanley family to make Knowsley Hall, the old hunting lodge that Sir John Stanley had acquired along with the Lathom estates in 1385, their permanent home. It was a difficult transition. Lathom had been the heart of Stanley power for nearly 3 centuries. Its great towers, its moat, its chapel, its vast kitchens and formal chambers. All of this was gone, reduced to rubble by parliamentarian cannon and demolition teams. The family had lost not merely a house, but a symbol, the physical embodiment of their authority over Lancashire. But the Stanleys, as always, adapted. The restoration of King Charles II in 1660 brought some relief. The 8th Earl, Charles, the son of the executed 7th Earl and his heroic wife Charlotte, was restored to his titles and to some of his family's confiscated lands. But the full wealth that the Stanleys had enjoyed before the Civil War was never entirely recovered. The merry monarch, Charles II, was generous with his words but careful with his purse, and the Stanley estates in Lancashire had been badly damaged by years of war and sequestration. It fell to the 10th Earl, who married exceptionally well and brought new wealth into the family, to abandon the dream of rebuilding Lathom and instead to invest in making Knowsley a house worthy of the Earls of Derby. The 9th Earl rebuilt parts of the structure and successive generations expanded and improved it. The Georgian wing was added in the 1720s, giving the house its present-day grandeur, and a great state dining room was built in 1820 for a visit by King George IV. The medieval building that had been constructed in 1495 as royal lodgings for Henry VII, Thomas Stanley's stepson, the man for whom Bosworth was fought, still survives within the modern house, a direct physical link to the age of the Wars of the Roses. The park around Knowsley was landscaped by Capability Brown, the great 18th century garden designer, giving it the rolling, naturalistic appearance that it retains today. The estate eventually grew to encompass thousands of acres, and in the 20th century, part of the park was opened as Knowsley Safari Park, a rather unexpected use for the ancestral grounds of medieval kingmakers, but one that the pragmatic Stanleys would no doubt have appreciated. Knowsley Hall remains the seat of the Earls of Derby to this day. The centuries that followed the Civil War brought a different kind of prominence to the House of Stanley. They were no longer kingmakers in the medieval sense. The age of armoured knights and shifting feudal loyalties had given way to the age of Parliament, of party politics, and of the slowly expanding franchise. The sword had been replaced by the vote, the retainer by the constituent, and the fortified castle by the country house. But the Stanleys adapted, as Stanleys always did, and they found new ways to exercise power. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 had secured the family's survival. The earldom was intact. The Isle of Man was still theirs. It would remain in Stanley hands until 1736, when the line of male descent failed and the lordship passed to the Dukes of Atholl, and Knowsley was steadily being transformed from a medieval hunting lodge into a great house befitting one of the premier families of England. For 3 centuries after the Civil War, the Earls of Derby served as Lords Lieutenant of Lancashire, the Crown's representatives in the county. They were, in effect, the unofficial rulers of the Northwest, just as their medieval ancestors had been. But now they governed through commissions and committees, rather than through retainers and fortified houses. They lived in considerable state at Knowsley, surrounded by a great park and attended by a large household, and they wielded an influence over local affairs that few other noble families could match. The most politically significant of the later Stanleys was Edward George Geoffrey Smith Stanley, the 14th Earl of Derby, who was born at Knowsley Hall on the 29th of March, 1799. Edward Stanley was educated at Eton and Christ Church, Oxford, and he entered Parliament as a Whig in 1822, sitting for the Rotten Borough of Stockbridge, a seat that had been purchased for him by his grandfather, the 12th Earl. He was immediately noted for his oratorical abilities. He spoke with clarity, authority, and a natural command that impressed even his opponents. Benjamin Disraeli, who would later serve as his political partner and rival, described him as one of the finest speakers he had ever heard. In the House of Commons, Stanley was a commanding presence, tall, aristocratic, and possessed of a voice that could fill the chamber without apparent effort. He had the gift of making complex arguments sound simple and of investing even dry policy discussions with a sense of urgency and importance. Edward's early career was spent as a Whig and then as a moderate reformer. He served as Chief Secretary for Ireland under Lord Grey, where he worked on education policy and championed the cause of Irish elementary schooling. A reforming zeal that surprised many of his contemporaries and hinted at a complexity of character that went beyond the usual aristocratic conservatism. He later served as colonial secretary under Sir Robert Peel, overseeing the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, a measure he supported with genuine conviction. He was, in these early years, a man of progressive instincts and considerable moral courage. But in the mid-1840s, a great political crisis divided the Conservative Party, and Edward Stanley found himself at its centre. The crisis was over the Corn Laws, tariffs that protected English agricultural interests by keeping the price of imported grain artificially high. The system benefited landowners, including, of course, the Stanleys themselves, but it kept bread prices painfully high for the working poor. When Sir Robert Peel moved to abolish the Corn Laws in response to the devastating Irish famine, the Conservative Party split. Peel's supporters, the Free Traders, backed abolition. The protectionists, led by Edward Stanley, opposed it. The fight was bitter, personal, and decisive. Peel won the vote, but he lost his party. Stanley emerged as the leader of the protectionist Conservatives, and from 1846 he was the undisputed leader of the Conservative Party as a whole. It was a position he would hold for 22 years, a span of leadership that remains to this day the longest in the history of the Conservative Party. Stanley's father died in 1851, and Edward inherited the title of 14th Earl of Derby. The following year he was asked by Queen Victoria to form a government, and he became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for the first time. It was the beginning of a remarkable but frustrating political career. Derby served as Prime Minister 3 times. In 1852, from 1858 to 1859, and from 1866 to 1868, making him the first person in British history to hold the office on 3 separate occasions. None of his 3 terms in office lasted long, and he never commanded a majority in the House of Commons. His first government is remembered mainly for an episode at its formation. When the list of Derby's inexperienced ministers was read aloud in the House of Lords, the elderly and deaf Duke of Wellington, unable to recognise any of the names, kept calling out, "Who? Who?" earning the administration the nickname the Who Ministry. Despite these limitations, Derby's influence on British politics was substantial. During his 3rd and final term, his government passed the Reform Act of 1867, which significantly expanded the voting franchise, a reform that Derby had not originally supported, but which he shepherded through Parliament with skill and pragmatism. It was, in a sense, the most Stanley thing imaginable. A man who had spent his career opposing reform ended up delivering one of the most important reforms of the century. Derby resigned as Prime Minister in February 1868, citing ill health. He was succeeded by his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Benjamin Disraeli, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated politicians of the Victorian age. Derby died on the 23rd of October 1869 at Knowsley Hall, at the age of 70. He was buried at St. Mary's Church in Knowsley, where a memorial chapel was later built in his honour. His reputation has faded with the years. He is sometimes called the Forgotten Prime Minister, overshadowed by the more colourful figures who surrounded him, Disraeli, Gladstone, Palmerston. But his place in the story of the Stanley family is secure. He was, in his own quiet way, exactly what the Stanleys had always been, a man who held power through persistence, pragmatism, and an instinct for survival. But the most unexpected chapter in the Stanley family's legacy was written not in the halls of Westminster, but on the frozen lakes and rinks of Canada. Frederick Arthur Stanley, the 16th Earl of Derby, was born on the 15th of January, 1841, the second surviving son of the 14th Earl. Like his father, Frederick was educated at Eton and entered the army before turning to politics. He served as a Member of Parliament, as Financial Secretary to the War Office, as Secretary of State for the Colonies, and in 1886 he was created Baron Stanley of Preston, a title that placed him in the House of Lords. In 1888, Queen Victoria appointed Frederick Stanley as Governor-General of Canada. It was in Canada that Frederick discovered a passion that would make the Stanley name famous far beyond the world of English politics and far beyond the borders of the British Empire. At the Montreal Winter Carnival of 1888, Frederick attended his first ice hockey match, a game between the Montreal Victorias and the Montreal Hockey Club, played on an outdoor rink in the sharp Canadian winter. And he was immediately captivated. The Montreal Gazette reported that the Governor-General expressed his great delight with the game of hockey and the expertise of the players. It was a moment of genuine enthusiasm from a man who, like many of his family, had a deep love of sport. Frederick fell in love with the speed, the skill, and the drama of ice hockey, and so did his children. His sons took up the game with passion, organising matches on the frozen rink at Rideau Hall, the Governor-General's residence in Ottawa. His daughter, Lady Isabel Stanley, became one of the earliest European women known to have played ice hockey, participating in a match at the Rideau skating rink in 1899. She is honoured today as a pioneer of the women's game, and the championship trophy of the Premier Hockey Federation, the Isabel Cup, bears her name. The Stanley family's enthusiasm for hockey was genuine and infectious. Frederick used his wealth and his position to promote the sport across Canada, supporting tournaments and encouraging the formation of new clubs. He understood, instinctively, that hockey was more than a game. It was becoming part of the Canadian national identity, and he wanted to encourage its growth. In 1892, Frederick Stanley decided to do something to formalise his support. He purchased a silver bowl, or more precisely, a decorative punch bowl, from a London silversmith for the sum of 10 guineas, which was then equivalent to roughly $50. He donated this bowl to be awarded annually to the best amateur hockey club in Canada. He called it the Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup. The world would come to know it as the Stanley Cup. The first Stanley Cup was awarded in 1893 to the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association. In the years that followed, it became the most prestigious trophy in Canadian hockey. And after 1926, when the National Hockey League took full possession of the cup, it became the championship trophy of professional hockey in North America. Today, the Stanley Cup is the oldest professional sports championship trophy in North America. It is also, by common consent, one of the most famous trophies in the world. Every year, the winning team hoists it above their heads in celebration, and Lord Stanley's name is spoken by millions of fans who may know nothing about the Wars of the Roses or the Battle of Bosworth Field. There is something wonderfully improbable about this connection. A family that made its name in the muddy fields of medieval Lancashire, that rose to power through marriages and fence-sitting, and one decisive cavalry charge on an August morning in 1485, has become immortalised in a sport that is played on ice, in arenas that seat 20,000 people, in cities that the first Earl of Derby could not have imagined existed. The Stanley Cup has been paraded through the streets of New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Montreal. It has been filled with champagne and drunk from by athletes who wear helmets and skates instead of armour and spurs. It is a strange and beautiful legacy, and one that Frederick Stanley himself, who purchased his modest silver bowl for 10 guineas, could never have foreseen. Frederick Stanley returned to England in 1893 and succeeded his brother as the 16th Earl of Derby. He died on the 14th of June, 1908, at the age of 67, and was succeeded by his eldest son, Edward. The family continued at Knowsley Hall as it had for more than 5 centuries, managing their estates, serving their country, and carrying forward the name that Sir John Stanley had first made great in the days of Richard II. If you visit Knowsley Hall today, you will find a house that still bears the marks of its long history. The medieval core, built in 1495 as lodgings for Henry VII, the king whose crown the Stanleys placed on his head at Bosworth, still stands within the fabric of the building. The Georgian wings added in the 1720s give the house its present-day grandeur. The great park, with its ancient trees and its famous safari park, stretches away to the east of Liverpool, a reminder of the days when the Stanleys were the undisputed lords of this landscape. The 19th Earl of Derby, Edward Richard William Stanley, born in 1962, is the current holder of the title. He was educated at Eton and Sandhurst, served in the Grenadier Guards and later studied farming and estate management at the Royal Agricultural College. He lives at Knowsley Hall with his family, continuing a tradition of residence that stretches back to 1385, when Sir John Stanley married Isabel Lathom and first set foot in these quiet Lancashire fields. 600 years. That is how long the Stanleys have held their place in the northwest of England. 600 years of marriages and battles, of coronations and executions, of sieges and parliaments, and ice hockey. It is a span of time that defies easy comprehension. The family that began as minor Staffordshire gentry, whose ancestor Adam de Stanley lived in the time of King Stephen, has endured through the Middle Ages, the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor Age, the Elizabethan era, the Civil War, the Georgian period, the Victorian Age, 2 world wars, and into the present century. Consider what that means. When the first John Stanley married Isabel Lathom in 1385 and made Knowsley his home, the 100 Years' War between England and France was still raging. Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales, and the very concept of a united kingdom of England was still fragile and contested. When Charlotte de la Trémoille defended Lathom House in 1644, Shakespeare had been dead for 28 years, and the world was still trying to absorb the implications of the printing press and the Reformation. When the 14th Earl served as Prime Minister in the 1860s, the British Empire spanned the globe. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species, and the American Civil War was tearing the New World apart. When the 16th Earl donated the Stanley Cup in 1892, the telephone was a novelty, the motor car was a curiosity, and the great age of imperial expansion was reaching its zenith. Through all of these transformations, political, social, technological, cultural, the Stanleys endured. They adapted. They held Knowsley, managed their estates, married well, served the state in whatever form the state took, and passed their title from generation to generation with a persistence that is almost botanical in its steadiness. They have produced knights and earls, kings of an island and lords of a great park. They have been praised as kingmakers and condemned as traitors. They have sheltered Shakespeare and defied Cromwell. They have served as Prime Minister and given the world its most famous sporting trophy. They have known triumph and tragedy, glory and disgrace, and they have survived it all. And through it all, the quality that defined them has never changed. The Stanleys waited. They watched. They calculated. And when the moment came, when the battle was in the balance and the future of England hung upon a single decision, they chose. They chose last. They chose carefully. And more often than not, they chose right. Thomas Stanley, the first Earl of Derby, the man who sat on his horse at Bosworth and watched the fighting from a distance before placing the crown on Henry Tudor's head. Thomas would have understood his descendants perfectly. He would have recognised the 14 Earls' cautious management of the Conservative Party and the 16th Earl's shrewd investment in a silver cup that would carry the Stanley name across oceans and centuries. He would have approved of Charlotte de la Trémoille's courage at Lathom, even if he would never have done anything so reckless himself. And he would have smiled, perhaps, at the thought that a family built on the art of not choosing had somehow ended up choosing everything, everything that mattered. At the moment, it mattered most. The fire is low now, and the house is quiet. The stories of the Stanleys, their long rise, their patient cunning, their moments of glory and their moments of shame, have carried us far into the night. From the moorlands of Staffordshire to the towers of Lathom, from the bloody field of Bosworth to the ice rinks of Montreal, the House of Stanley has endured. We have walked with Sir John Stanley through the rain-soaked fields of medieval Armies. We have watched Thomas, the first Earl, sitting motionless on his horse while a kingdom changed hands around him. We have felt the ground shake as William's cavalry charge crashed into Richard's bodyguard. We have heard the shouts of the victors and seen the crown placed upon a new king's head. We have listened to the words of Shakespeare spoken first by actors in the service of the Stanleys. We have stood on the walls of Lathom with Charlotte de la Trémoille, watching the enemy's campfires flicker in the darkness. And we have followed the Stanley name across the Atlantic to a frozen rink in Montreal, where a silver cup became the most famous trophy in the world. It is a story that spans 6 centuries and crosses oceans. It is a story of power and patience, of calculation and courage, of families who rise and endure not through a single act of heroism, but through the steady, unglamorous work of survival. The Stanleys were never the most loved family in England. They were never the most trusted, but they were, perhaps, the most enduring. And in the long run, endurance matters more than anything. They are still here. They are still at Knowsley. They are still, after 600 years, exactly where a Stanley would want to be. In the right place, at the right time, on the right side. And on that gentle thought, we wish you a peaceful and restful sleep. Thank you for spending this evening with Sleepy Nobles. If these quiet stories from history helped you drift off, a like, a subscription, and a gentle comment all help other listeners find their way to our fire. We will be here whenever you need us, with another story, another house, another life, told softly in the dark. Until then, rest well.